Keep your hands where I can see them. Palms flat.
You got it.
Feet apart. Relax. Package inventory in progress. Stand by. Copy that. One in custody. Second is clear.
What's he doing?
I've got him.
Good evening. Federal agents descended on dozens of addresses across the Chicago area before dawn today, wrapping up a months-long investigation into a delivery-based smuggling network. The coordinated sweeps brought in at least 38 suspects and uncovered contraband hidden inside ordinary packages.
The first arrest happened at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the streets of Chicago were still quiet and the autumn wind carried the smell of rain. A DoorDash driver named Miguel Espinosa was completing what he thought was his final delivery of the night shift, a bag of breakfast burritos from a 24-hour taqueria on the southwest side, when three black Chevrolet Suburbans appeared from nowhere and boxed in his Honda Civic at an intersection near Midway Airport. Before Miguel could process what was happening, men in tactical gear were surrounding his vehicle, weapons drawn, shouting commands that blurred together in a wall of sound. He was pulled from the car, thrown to the pavement, and handcuffed with the efficiency that suggested his captors had done this many times before. The DoorDash bag, still warm with its cargo of eggs and chorizo, was torn open and discarded. The real target was the thermal food delivery bag in his back seat, the one with the false bottom, the one containing 8 kilograms of fentanyl with a street value exceeding $2 million. Miguel Espinosa was the first of 89 arrests that would take place over the next 4 hours, a coordinated strike across the greater Chicago metropolitan area that would ultimately seize 4.2 tons of fentanyl, dismantle a distribution network that had operated undetected for nearly 3 years, and expose one of the most innovative drug trafficking operations in American history. Special Agent Raymond Brooks watched the operation unfold from a command center in the FBI's Chicago field office, surrounded by monitors showing live feeds from dozens of arrest teams. At 53 years old, Raymond had spent 28 years with the Bureau, the last 15 focused on narcotics trafficking and organized crime. He had seen cartels adapt to changing circumstances before, had watched them evolve from obvious fronts like car washes and check-cashing stores to increasingly sophisticated methods of moving product. But what the Sinaloa Cartel had built in Chicago was something new, something that exploited the fundamental changes in American consumer behavior that had accelerated during the pandemic years. They had weaponized the gig economy. The investigation had begun 14 months earlier, with a pattern that almost no one would have noticed. A DEA analyst in Washington, reviewing overdose statistics from across the Midwest, had observed something curious about the geographic distribution of fentanyl deaths in Chicago. The drug was appearing in neighborhoods where it had rarely been seen before, affluent suburbs and gentrifying urban areas where traditional street-level dealing was virtually non-existent. The victims were often young professionals, people who had never visited a corner dealer in their lives, who had somehow obtained laboratory-grade fentanyl without any apparent connection to the usual distribution networks. The analyst had flagged the pattern, and the flag had eventually reached Raymond's desk. He had been skeptical at first. Fentanyl was everywhere now, flowing across the border in quantities that defied comprehension, finding its way into every community regardless of income or demographics. The idea that there was something special about the Chicago pattern seemed like a stretch, but Raymond had learned to trust anomalies. In his experience, the cases that broke open the biggest operations always started with something that didn't quite fit, a detail that nagged at the back of your mind until you finally gave it the attention it deserved. He had assigned a small team to look into the Chicago pattern, expecting them to come back with nothing. Instead, after 3 weeks of analysis, they had come back with a theory that sounded like science fiction. The fentanyl wasn't being distributed through traditional channels at all. It was being delivered directly to customers' homes, hidden inside the same thermal bags that carried their restaurant orders, transported by drivers who had no idea what they were really carrying. The cartel had infiltrated DoorDash, not the company itself, which was entirely unaware of what was happening, but the platform, the system, the infrastructure that connected restaurants and drivers and customers through an app on their phones. The cartel had figured out how to exploit that system, to insert their own orders into the flow of legitimate deliveries, to use unwitting drivers as mules who never questioned why certain orders always paid unusually well and came from restaurants that seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of midnight customers. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. The cartel had established a network of shell restaurants, storefronts that appeared on the DoorDash platform as legitimate businesses, but existed solely to package and distribute drugs. They had names like Taco Rico and Lucky Dragon Express, and Bella Napoli, generic enough to avoid suspicion, with menus full of items that no one ever actually ordered. When a customer wanted fentanyl, they placed an order through a coded system that looked like a normal food purchase, but actually specified the quantity and type of drug they wanted. The order went to the Shell restaurant, where workers packaged the drugs into thermal bags designed with hidden compartments. A DoorDash driver would pick up the order, believing they were transporting food, and deliver it to the customer, who retrieved the drugs while the driver remained completely oblivious. The drivers were chosen carefully. The algorithm, manipulated by cartel hackers who had gained access to DoorDash's back-end systems, routed these special orders only to drivers who met certain criteria. Recent immigrants with limited English, students desperate for extra income, single parents working multiple jobs, anyone who was unlikely to ask questions or notice discrepancies. The orders always tipped well, extraordinarily well, ensuring that drivers would compete for them and never complain about unusual pickup locations or odd delivery instructions. Raymond's team had spent months mapping the network, identifying the Shell restaurants, tracking the flow of drugs and money, building cases against the organizers while gathering evidence against the delivery drivers who might have been knowing participants rather than unwitting dupes. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by the decentralized nature of the operation and the legitimate cover provided by thousands of actual food deliveries happening simultaneously across the city. The breakthrough had come 6 weeks ago, when a mid-level cartel operative in Mexico had been arrested by federal police on an unrelated charge. Facing decades in prison, he had offered to trade information for leniency, and among the details he provided was the identity of the Chicago operations architect, a man named Eduardo Reyes, formerly a software engineer at a major technology company who had been recruited by the Sinaloa Cartel to design logistics systems for their North American distribution network. Reyes was a ghost. He had no permanent address, no registered vehicles, no social media presence, nothing that would allow law enforcement to track him down. But he had one weakness. He was proud of his work. He couldn't resist occasional visits to the Shell restaurants he had established, checking on operations, making sure his system was running smoothly. And he had developed a pattern, arriving at certain locations at certain times on certain days, a pattern that Raymond's surveillance teams had finally identified. Today, Eduardo Reyes was scheduled to visit a restaurant called Casa del Sol in the Pilsen neighborhood at 8 almost a.m. And when he walked through that door, Raymond intended to be waiting for him. But first, they had to take down the delivery network. 89 drivers had been identified as probable knowing participants in the scheme, individuals who had made too many deliveries from Shell restaurants, who had received payments that far exceeded normal tips, who had shown patterns of behavior suggesting they understood exactly what they were transporting. Arresting them simultaneously was essential to prevent warnings from spreading through the network. Raymond watched the monitors as teams reported in. Alpha Team has Target 1 in custody. Bravo Team has Target 4 in custody. Charlie Team has Target 7 through 9 in custody. The numbers climbed steadily as the morning wore on. Each arrest another node removed from the distribution network, each seized delivery bag another batch of poison that would never reach the streets. By 10:30 a.m., 87 of the 89 targets were in custody. 2 had failed to appear at their expected locations, likely having received some kind of warning despite the operation's secrecy. Raymond would deal with them later. Right now, his focus was on the command center's main monitor, which showed a live feed from a surveillance team positioned outside Casa del Sol. The restaurant occupied a converted storefront on 18th Street, wedged between a laundromat and a cell phone repair shop. It had opened 3 years ago with modest fanfare, advertising authentic Mexican cuisine and late-night delivery service. Its reviews on Yelp were mediocre, complaints about slow service and cold food, but that hadn't mattered. The restaurant's real business had nothing to do with tamales or enchiladas. At 7:58 a.m., a black Tesla Model S pulled into the small parking lot behind the restaurant. Raymond leaned forward, watching as a figure emerged from the vehicle. Eduardo Reyes was younger than Raymond had expected, mid-30s at most, with a slim build and glasses that gave him the look of a graduate student rather than a drug kingpin. He was wearing jeans and a casual sweater, carrying a laptop bag over his shoulder, looking for all the world like someone arriving for a morning of remote work at his favorite coffee shop. "All teams, this is command," Raymond spoke into his radio. "Target 0 is on site. Prepare for entry on my mark." He waited until Reyes had entered the restaurant, giving him time to get settled, to feel comfortable, to let his guard down. Then he keyed the radio again. "Execute." The arrest of Eduardo Reyes took less than 30 seconds. FBI agents entered through the front and back doors simultaneously, catching Reyes and 4 other individuals inside completely off guard. There was no resistance, no attempt to flee, no dramatic confrontation. Reyes simply raised his hands and allowed himself to be handcuffed, his expression showing nothing but resigned acceptance. But it was what they found inside the restaurant that would make headlines around the world. Behind the kitchen, accessible through a hidden door disguised as a walk-in freezer, was a warehouse space that occupied the buildings on either side of Casa del Sol. The cartel had quietly purchased all three properties and converted them into a single facility, maintaining the facades of separate businesses while creating a distribution hub capable of processing hundreds of kilograms of fentanyl per week. The warehouse contained industrial-scale packaging equipment capable of producing tens of thousands of individual doses per hour. It contained sophisticated laboratory equipment for testing and cutting the raw fentanyl that arrived from Mexico. It contained a server room with computers that controlled the entire DoorDash infiltration scheme, from the fake restaurant profiles to the algorithm manipulation to the payment systems that laundered drug money through what appeared to be normal delivery tips. And it contained fentanyl. Bricks and bricks of fentanyl stacked on pallets that reached toward the ceiling, more of the drug than Raymond had ever seen in one place. The preliminary estimate from the hazmat team that would eventually process the scene was 4.2 tons, enough to deliver a fatal dose to every person in the United States multiple times over. Raymond stood in the doorway of the warehouse wearing protective equipment that made him feel like an astronaut exploring an alien world, and tried to comprehend the scale of what he was seeing. In his 28 years with the Bureau, he had participated in hundreds of drug seizures. He had seen cartel safe houses and smuggling tunnels and transport ships loaded with narcotics. But nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't just a drug operation. It was an infrastructure, a system designed to saturate an entire city with death. And it had been operating in plain sight, hidden behind the mundane familiarity of food delivery, exploiting the same platforms that brought pizza and Chinese takeout to millions of American homes. He thought about all the drivers they had arrested that morning, the ones who had known what they were carrying, and the ones who hadn't. He thought about all the customers who had placed orders through coded messages, believing they were being clever by avoiding street corners and obvious dealers. He thought about all the overdose victims whose deaths had first flagged this pattern. Young people mostly, professionals with futures ahead of them, who had died alone in apartments surrounded by the detritus of their final meal. And he thought about Eduardo Reyes, the architect of this horror, sitting in an interrogation room downtown, already calculating how much information he could trade for a reduced sentence. Raymond turned away from the warehouse and walked out into the cold Chicago morning. The arrest teams were still processing the scene, photographing evidence, cataloging seized materials, trying to document the full scope of what they had uncovered. Reporters were already gathering at the perimeter, held back by Chicago police officers who looked as stunned as everyone else. Helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing footage that would be broadcast on every news channel within the hour. He pulled out his phone and called the number that had been on his speed dial for 15 years. The direct line to the FBI director in Washington. "It's done," he said when the director answered. "We got him. We got all of them." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "How bad is it?" Raymond looked back at the restaurant, at the ordinary facade that had hidden such extraordinary evil. "Worse than we imagined, sir. Much worse." The interrogation of Eduardo Reyes began at 2 p.m. in a windowless room at the FBI's Chicago field office. Raymond sat across the table from him, studying the man who had built the most sophisticated drug distribution network in American history. Up close, Reyes looked even younger than he had in the surveillance footage, with smooth skin and bright eyes that showed no trace of guilt or remorse. He had already been Mirandized, had already declined to request an attorney, had already indicated a willingness to cooperate in exchange for consideration at sentencing. Raymond had seen this before, the calculated gambit of an intelligent criminal who understood that fighting was pointless and that information was his only remaining currency. "You know what we found in that warehouse," Raymond said. "You know what you're facing. Multiple life sentences, minimum, unless you give me something I can use." Reyes nodded slowly. "I understand, and I'm prepared to cooperate fully. But first, I want you to understand something. What you found today, what you disrupted, it's not the whole picture. It's not even the biggest part of the picture." Raymond kept his expression neutral, though his heart rate accelerated slightly. "Explain." "Chicago was a pilot program. Proof of concept. We've been operating here for 3 years, refining our methods, working out the bugs. The system you discovered, the restaurant fronts, the algorithm manipulation, the delivery network. It all works. It works better than anyone expected. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. In the past 6 months, we've begun replicating the Chicago model in 14 other cities. Los Angeles, New York, Houston, Atlanta, Miami, Phoenix, Philadelphia, Detroit, Seattle, Denver, San Diego, Boston, San Francisco, Dallas. Each city has its own network, its own shell restaurants, its own delivery infrastructure. Some of them are already fully operational. Others are still in the build-out phase. Raymond felt the floor shifting beneath him. If what Reyes was saying was true, then today's operation hadn't dismantled a drug network. It had merely pruned one branch of an oak tree. Why are you telling me this? Reyes smiled, a thin expression without warmth. Because I want to live. Because I know what happens to people who become liabilities to the organization. Because the only way I survive long enough to see the inside of a prison cell is if I give you enough value that you'll protect me. He leaned back in his chair. I can give you everything. The locations of every Shell restaurant in every city. The names of the operators. The access codes for the systems I built. The bank accounts where the money flows. Everything you need to take down the entire network. Not just Chicago, but all of it. And what do you want in return? Witness protection. A new identity. Somewhere far from anywhere the cartel can reach. I know. I'm going to prison, Agent Brooks. I'm not asking for freedom. I'm asking for life. Raymond studied him for a long moment. Reyes was a monster, responsible for thousands of deaths. The architect of a system designed to spread addiction and suffering across an entire continent. Every instinct Raymond had developed over nearly 3 decades of law enforcement screamed that this man deserved to suffer, to spend the rest of his life in the darkest cell they could find. But Raymond also understood reality. Reyes had information that could save countless lives, that could prevent the fentanyl network from metastasizing into every major American city. And the decision about his ultimate fate wasn't Raymond's to make. That would be up to prosecutors and judges and the imperfect machinery of the justice system. I'll make some calls, Raymond said. But I need a gesture of good faith first. Something I can verify independently. Something that proves you're not wasting my time. Reyes nodded. There's a shipment arriving in Los Angeles tomorrow morning. 1,200 kilograms, coming through the port of Long Beach in a container of ceramic tiles. The container number is MSCU 4821673. The receiving company is called Pacific Rim Imports, based in Commerce, California. If you move fast enough, you can intercept it. Raymond wrote down the details, his mind already racing ahead to the coordination required for such an operation. If this checks out, we'll talk about next steps. We'll check out. I'm not stupid, Agent Brooks. I know my only value is the accuracy of my information. The moment I give you something false, I become worthless, and worthless people don't survive what's coming. Raymond stood up and headed for the door. Get comfortable. This is going to be a long night. He stepped out of the interrogation room and immediately called his counterpart in the FBI's Los Angeles field office. Within the hour, a team was assembling to intercept the container Reyes had described. Within 2 hours, they had confirmed that Pacific Rim Imports was indeed a shell company with no legitimate business operations. And within 4 hours, they had obtained a warrant to inspect the container when it arrived at the port. The interception took place at dawn the next morning. Just as Reyes had promised, the container held 1,200 kilograms of fentanyl hidden inside hollow ceramic tiles that would have passed any routine inspection. The Los Angeles team made 7 arrests and seized documentation that confirmed connections to 3 of the 14 cities Reyes had named. Eduardo Reyes had proven his value. Now the real work began. The nationwide takedown operation, codenamed Operation Final Delivery, took 6 weeks to plan and coordinate. It involved more than 2,000 federal agents, local police officers, and international law enforcement partners across 14 cities and 4 countries. It required unprecedented cooperation between the IEOs, FBI, DEA, ICE, and Customs and Border Protection. It demanded that secrets be kept among hundreds of people who had to be briefed on the operation's scope and targets. Raymond served as the lead coordinator, working 18-hour days from a secure operations center in Washington, managing the flow of information from Eduardo Reyes to the teams in the field. Reyes proved to be everything he had promised, a font of detailed intelligence about every aspect of the network he had built, from the technology infrastructure to the human resources, to the financial systems that kept the money flowing back to Mexico. But Reyes also proved to be something else, a reminder of the ordinary face of evil. He spoke about his work with the detached professionalism of an engineer discussing a software project. He showed no emotion when describing the deaths his system had caused, No recognition that his elegant logistic solutions had destroyed thousands of lives. He was proud of what he had built, even as he helped to tear it down. Raymond found himself haunted by that pride. In his decades of fighting the drug trade, he had encountered every variety of criminal: violent enforcers who reveled in bloodshed, desperate addicts who had crossed into dealing to fund their habits, calculating businessmen who saw drugs as just another commodity. But he had never encountered anyone quite like Reyes, someone who seemed to view mass death as an acceptable cost of optimization. One night, late in the ADOCIRC planning process, Raymond asked Reyes the question that had been bothering him since the first interrogation. "Don't you feel anything? All those people who died because of what you built?" Reyes considered the question with apparent seriousness. "I feel interest. Intellectual interest in the problem I solved. The logistics of distributing a product to millions of customers without using traditional channels, it was fascinating. The challenge of hiding in plain sight, of using the infrastructure that already existed, of making the system self-sustaining and self-correcting. These were interesting problems. People died. Thousands of people. People die every day, Agent Brooks. From car accidents, from disease, from violence, from despair. The fentanyl I distributed didn't create the demand for it. The demand was already there. I simply found a more efficient way to meet that demand." "That's not an answer. That's a rationalization." Reyes shrugged. "Perhaps. But it's the only answer I have. I understand that you see me as a monster. You're probably right. But monsters don't feel like monsters from the inside. From the inside, we're just people solving problems." Raymond had no response to that. He simply stood up and left the room, returning to the work of dismantling the system Reyes had built. Operation Final Delivery launched at 5 a.m. Eastern Time on a Thursday in early December. The timing was chosen to maximize surprise and minimize the ability of targets to warn each other as news of the first arrests spread. Teams in all 14 cities moved simultaneously, executing warrants, making arrests, and seizing evidence in a coordinated wave that overwhelmed the network's ability to respond. Raymond monitored the operation from the Washington Command Center, watching as the reports flowed in. Los Angeles, 23 arrests, 800 kilograms of fentanyl seized. New York, 31 arrests, 600 kilograms seized. Houston, 18 arrests, 400 kilograms seized. The numbers climbed throughout the morning, each report adding to the total, each arrest another piece of the network removed. By noon, the preliminary numbers were staggering. More than 400 arrests across 14 cities. More than 8 tons of fentanyl seized, in addition to the 4.2 tons from the original Chicago raid. Dozens of Shell restaurants shut down and marked for forensic investigation. Computer systems containing terabytes of data about the network's operations, customer lists, and financial transactions. And perhaps most importantly, the disruption of the algorithm manipulation that had allowed the network to exploit DoorDash's platform. Reyes had provided the technical details that allowed FBI cyber specialists to identify and close the vulnerabilities the cartel had exploited. DoorDash's own security team, horrified by what had happened on their platform, had implemented emergency measures to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. The press conference announcing the results of Operation Final Delivery was held at FBI headquarters in Washington, with representatives from every agency that had participated. Raymond stood at the back of the room, watching as the Attorney General described the operation as the largest drug seizure in American history, as the FBI director praised the coordination between federal and local law enforcement, as the DEA administrator warned that the fight against